We all know Star Trek as one of the most influential sci-fi franchises of all time, right? It's given us iconic characters like Captain Kirk, Spock, and Jean-Luc Picard, and it's inspired real-life scientific innovations. But what if I told you that Star Trek almost looked very different? Like so different that it might not have become the beloved series we know today. There's this one story that never made it to air. A script that was developed behind the scenes but ultimately got scrapped. And if that story had gone forward, it could have completely changed the course of Star Trek. We're talking about different characters, different themes, and maybe even a different legacy for the entire show. Curious? Stick around as we dive into the Star Trek story that could have changed everything. Trust me, this is a what-if scenario you won't want to miss. Before we get into this fascinating scrapped story, let's talk about how Star Trek became the cultural phenomenon we know today. When Star Trek, the original series, first hit TV screens in 1966, it wasn't an instant hit. In fact, it struggled with ratings and was cancelled after just 3 seasons. But that wasn't the end. Far from it. Thanks to reruns, fan conventions, cinema movies, and eventually, Star Trek: The Next Generation in the late 1980s, the franchise exploded. What makes Star Trek so special? Well, unlike a lot of sci-fi at the time, it wasn't just about space battles and cool tech. Sure, there were starships, but Star Trek was about exploring deep philosophical questions, promoting diversity, and imagining a future where humanity had overcome war, poverty, and prejudice. It was an optimistic vision of the future, a refreshing change from the more dystopian sci-fi worlds out there. The series tackled tough issues like race relations, gender equality, and the ethics of war, topics that were highly relevant during the turbulent 1960s. For example, one of the most memorable moments came in the episode Plato's Stepchildren, which featured the first interracial kiss on American television between Captain Kirk and Lieutenant Uhura. This groundbreaking moment didn't just shock audiences, it sparked conversations that continued well beyond the series. But like any creative process, the journey wasn't smooth. Writers were constantly battling over ideas, and not all of them made it to the screen. That's where today's story comes in, a lost plot that could have sent Star Trek down a much darker path. So let's get into it. The story that never made it to air actually comes from Star Trek, the original series, or TOS as fans like to call it. In the early stages of developing the series, Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, and his team were tossing around different ideas for character development. One of the most shocking ideas? They almost made Mr. Spock, yes, the logical, half-Vulcan, pointy-eared Spock, completely human. That's right. One early draft of the series envisioned Spock as an entirely human character who was simply very cold, calculating, and emotionally distant. This version of Spock wouldn't have been the iconic, logical Vulcan we all know and love. He would have been portrayed more like a brooding intellectual, basically a brilliant but emotionally stunted human. Can you even imagine how different that would have been? The core dynamic between Spock, Kirk, and McCoy would have changed completely. Spock's struggle to balance his Vulcan logic and his suppressed human emotions became such a key part of his character. Without that, he's just another brainy crew member. That entire conflict would have vanished. Let's dig a little deeper into this early concept. In the initial drafts, Spock was written as an almost villainous figure. Think of him as the villain, in a way. His emotional detachment would have been a barrier between him and the crew, creating tension instead of camaraderie. Instead of being the crew's moral compass, he might have been seen as a cold, calculating antagonist. The chemistry we adore between Spock and the crew wouldn't have existed in the same way. The famous banter between Spock and McCoy would have been completely different. Instead of friendly jabs about emotions and logic, there would be a sense of resentment. McCoy could have been seen as the emotional foil to a more tyrannical Spock. So, what happened? Why didn't we get this human Spock? Well, we can thank Gene Roddenberry for that. He fought hard for Spock's Vulcan heritage because he felt it added depth and dimension to the show. It wasn't just a gimmick. Spock's character was a reflection of Star Trek's core message, exploring the complexities of identity, culture, and what it means to be human, even if you aren't entirely human. It's fascinating to think about how one character can embody so many layers of meaning. Spock's identity crisis resonated with viewers, offering a mirror to our own struggles with identity, acceptance, and belonging. By keeping Spock as half Vulcan, Roddenberry ensured that this central theme remained a cornerstone of the series. Now, you might be wondering, why was this human Spock idea even on the table in the first place? Well, at the time, the network executives weren't exactly thrilled with the idea of having a character that looked too alien. The pointed ears, the strange, emotionless demeanor. That was risky for 1960s TV. In fact, when they first saw Spock's makeup and ears, some executives thought he looked too demonic and they worried it would scare off viewers. Remember, this was a time when science fiction on television wasn't nearly as accepted as it is today. They were nervous about making the show too out there. Roddenberry, though, saw something different. He believed in Spock as a symbol of diversity. In a time when the civil rights movement was at its height, Star Trek was already pushing boundaries with its casting. Having a half-alien character who struggled to reconcile two parts of his identity was revolutionary. Roddenberry knew that representation mattered. He wanted to show that being different didn't mean being less than. In fact, the differences among the crew members were what made them stronger. Imagine a crew led by Captain Kirk, who was unafraid to embrace a Vulcan as his right-hand man. That unity amid diversity became a core message of the franchise. Luckily, Roddenberry got his way, and the Spock we all know, half human, half Vulcan, became a central figure of the series. But it wasn't easy. The network kept a close eye on Spock's development throughout the first season, and it's a miracle that his Vulcan traits weren't toned down further. Even in later series, Spock's character continued to resonate. The writers of Star Trek, The Next Generation, and subsequent series often reference Spock's legacy, ensuring that his complex identity was honored. It was a decision that shaped not just Star Trek, but the entire landscape of science fiction for decades to come. Alright, now let's have some fun with this. What if the network had gotten its way and Spock had been a fully human character? What would that have meant for Star Trek as a whole? The Kirk-Spock-McCoy trio would have changed dramatically if Spock were human. A human Spock would likely have been more emotional, lacking the legendary logic versus emotion debates with Dr. McCoy. In the show, Spock represents the mind, McCoy the heart, and Kirk the balance between the two. Without the Vulcan element, this dynamic might not have worked as well. The show's tone could have shifted, focusing less on collaboration and more on conflict. Star Trek has always embraced hope and unity, with Spock symbolizing the importance of diversity. His inner conflict between logic and compassion made him relatable and added depth. Without Spock's Vulcan heritage, the show might have leaned towards action over philosophy. Characters like Data or Worf might never have emerged, as Spock's role opened doors for exploring identity and difference in the Star Trek universe. So, what do you guys think? Would you have liked to see a fully human Spock? Or are you glad we got the logical half-Vulcan version? Let me know in the comments below. Until next time, live long and prosper and subscribe. Hit that bell icon and we'll keep you updated on all things science fiction.